Zariah Lane sat in silence, the ticking clock on the principal's wall louder than anything else in the room. Her backpack, frayed at the edges, sat limp at her feet, and her shoes, white, were split at the seams, clinging to life like she was to hope. Across the desk, Principal Mallory's expression was unreadable, cold in a way that made Zariah feel like a stain on the school's polished image. Mallory slid a thin file across the desk and folded her hands. "We've given enough chances, Zariah. You're 3 months behind on fees. Your seat will be given to someone who can pay." Zariah blinked rapidly, her vision blurring, her throat tightened. "Please," she whispered. "I'll catch up," my mom said, "next week." But Mallory cut her off with a firm shake of her head. "We're running a school, not a charity. I suggest you focus on your family's reality." Outside the iron school gate, Zariah's mother, Angela, waited with a hunched back and weary eyes. Her maid's uniform was soaked in sweat and the scent of bleach. She spotted Zariah walking out empty-handed and without her usual lanyard. When she heard the verdict, Angela's knees gave slightly. She covered her mouth and turned away, shoulders trembling with silent sobs. Zariah stood frozen, watching students stream past her, laughing in clean uniforms and clutching books she once carried with pride. Her own notebooks, spent and scribbled, were now clutched to her chest like sacred things, as if holding on to them could keep the dream from slipping away. That night, in the dim corner of their shared one-room apartment, Zariah sat cross-legged on the floor. She stared at her school ID for a long time, her name and photo staring back like a version of herself she was no longer allowed to be. Then, slowly, with trembling fingers, she tore it in half. Her tears came hot and fast, not just from shame, but from something deeper determination. She looked up into the darkness, whispering a vow that stitched itself into her bones. "One day, I'll walk back in through those gates, but not as a student." Zariah Lane had always been the kind of girl whose eyes lit up at the sight of a book, whose notebooks were filled not just with classwork but with questions, scrawled in the margins, questions she longed to understand. Born and raised in a cramped one-room apartment, she shared everything with her mother, Angela, woman whose back ached more each day from scrubbing strangers' floors and whose hands bore the story of sacrifice. Angela, a domestic worker for wealthier families, was often spoken to like furniture, invisible until needed. But she held her head high because she believed in one thing: if she could keep Zariah in school, even if it meant eating less or walking miles to work, then maybe, just maybe, her daughter would break the cycle that caged them. For years, Angela juggled jobs, hiding her exhaustion behind a pressed uniform and a fake smile. But when illness crept in, chronic fatigue, chest pains, dizzy spells, she simply couldn't keep up. The money dried up, the school fees stopped. Zariah, desperate not to fall behind, offered to clean classrooms, wash chalkboards, mop hallways in exchange for tuition. The headmistress didn't even look her in the eye when she responded, "We don't accept pity labor." The words stung more than the laughter that followed from students who'd overheard. Her classmates, wrapped in privilege and pressed collars, mocked her worn-out shoes and threadbare uniforms. Teachers looked past her raised hand, pretending not to notice the girl with hunger behind her eyes. Only Mr. David Cole, the literature teacher, saw her. He began slipping her used textbooks after class, quietly encouraging her to keep reading, to keep thinking, to not stop believing. Even after the expulsion, he found ways to pass her new materials. "You don't need a classroom to be educated," he told her once. "You just need hunger. You've got that more than any of them." After she dropped out, Zariah didn't waste time grieving. She gritted her teeth and got to work. By day, she cleaned homes, waited tables, ran errands. By night, she studied under flickering street lamps, borrowed textbooks from second-hand shops, and started tutoring younger kids in the neighborhood to earn a few coins. She taught phonics to first graders, solved algebra with teens struggling like she once did. And slowly, quietly, word spread, Miss Z can help. Now 24, Zariah runs a makeshift tutoring center from her garage. The walls are still cracked, but the space hums with purpose. Kids sit cross-legged on rugs, whiteboards lean against stacked crates, and hand-drawn posters encourage things like keep trying and your story matters. The kids adore her, they call her Miss Z, with respect and affection, and parents in the neighborhood say she's saving their children one lesson at a time. She saves every extra dime, barely spending on herself. Her dream is clear and unwavering. One day, she will open a real school. Not just a center, not just a program, but a school one that doesn't throw kids away for being poor. One where a child like the girl she once was could walk through the gates and be seen, not dismissed. Zariah may have been expelled by poverty, but it never robbed her of purpose. And she's only just getting started. It started with a chance encounter at a crowded local literacy fair, where Zariah had set up a humble booth draped with hand-painted signs and dog-eared books. She was guiding a group of kids through a spelling game when she heard her name's Raya Lane. She turned and found herself face to face with Avery Thomas, once a classmate in the pristine halls of Cambridge Prep, now holding a press badge and a recorder. He stared at her, stunned. "You're Miss Z?" he asked, disbelief giving way to admiration. Zariah smiled politely, unsure what to make of it. Avery remembered her differently, shy, quiet, always on the outskirts. But now, she stood taller, sure of herself, surrounded by children who leaned in when she spoke. He asked for an interview. She hesitated, then nodded. A week later, the headline hit like wildfire. Asterisk, the girl who was expelled, now teaching the street. Avery's piece told her story in full: the poverty, the injustice, the resilience. The article went viral overnight, touching nerves far beyond the city. Donations began to pour in from strangers across the country. Former teachers, local businesses, even celebrities shared the piece, praising her grit. But one offer changed everything. A retired teacher named Mrs. Barron emailed her directly, offering access to an old building she'd inherited, an abandoned school, long shuttered, almost forgotten. "I've been waiting for someone like you," she wrote. Zariah followed the address. Her breath caught when she pulled up to the gates. The paint was peeling, the playground rusted, the sign faded and half broken, but there was no mistaking it. Cambridge Preparatory School, her old school, the same one that had cast her out without a second thought. Years of mismanagement had drained its funds, and after going bankrupt, it was quietly auctioned off by the bank. No one wanted it, until now. With trembling hands, Zariah signed the deed in a dusty corner office that once belonged to Principal Mallory. The paper shook beneath her fingers, but her grip didn't waver. As the ink dried, she looked around the building, its cracked tiles, its long-forgotten classrooms, and felt a rush of something deeper than triumph. It wasn't just about proving anyone wrong. It was about reclaiming something that had once stolen her dignity. She stepped into the hallway where she once walked with her head down, where laughter and whispers followed her every fraying step. But this time, the silence didn't feel cruel. It felt full of possibility. This time, she wasn't the girl begging to stay. She was the woman unlocking the doors. The owner, the grand reopening of the former Cambridge Prep, now reborn as Lane Academy, stirred excitement like wildfire. Zariah stood at the front gate with her mother by her side, a fresh sign gleaming above them, a school that doesn't forget its children. Word spread fast. This was no ordinary school. Lane Academy would be tuition-free, open to low-income students who had been cast aside by a system more concerned with fees than futures. Within days, applications flooded in. Former classmates, now educators themselves, reached out, inspired and eager to join her mission. Volunteers showed up with paintbrushes and lesson plans. Parents signed up their kids, and community leaders hailed her as a symbol of resilience. News outlets returned for interviews. Zariah Lane once expelled, now leading a revolution. In education, but not everyone applauded. Somewhere across town, Principal Mallory saw the broadcast on her office television. Her jaw tightened. The world was praising a girl she remembered as difficult, over-emotional, disruptive. In her bitterness, she began telling a different version of the past to anyone who would listen. Zariah was a troubled student, she said in interviews. She's twisting the truth to make herself look like a hero. She was removed for consistent behavioral issues, not because of poverty. Few believed her, but that didn't stop her from taking it further. Days later, she appeared uninvited at Lane Academy's doorstep, her heels echoing in the entry. Hall that once bore her rule. Zariah met her with a calm, steady gaze. Mallory extended a forced smile and a suggestion. Given my experience, I'd be happy to serve as part of your leadership team. The room went still. Zariah's voice didn't rise, but it cut deep. Children deserve better than someone who turned her back on them. The door closed behind Mallory before she could reply. That was the beginning of the pushback. Shortly after, Zariah received a letter from the district's school board, dry, official, and full of veiled threats. It stated she was using unauthorized copies of licensed educational materials that still legally belonged to the district. They demanded she cease distribution or face legal action. Lane Academy hadn't even finished its first semester. Panic set in. Social media trolls emerged, fueled by Mallory's comments. Anonymous accounts called her a fraud. Old photos circulated, with cruel captions, rags to riches, or just rags. Donations, once steady, slowed to a trickle. Then came the hardest blow. Angela collapsed at work. The hospital visit was brief but ominous. Her illness had returned, more aggressive now. Medical bills loomed again. Zariah sat by her mother's bedside, watching the monitors beep, the scent of antiseptic dragging her back to old nightmares. Her phone buzzed with questions. Parents asking if Lane Academy would shut down. Staff asking if their jobs were safe. She couldn't answer. At home that night, Zariah stood in her dimly lit living room, alone with the storm inside her. The walls of the school she'd fought to restore now felt paper-thin. The legacy she tried to rewrite smeared in public doubt. She looked at the floorboards, her breath shallow. Was I foolish to believe I could rewrite my story? Whispered into the silence. The question echoed, raw and haunting. For the first time since she tore her school ID in half, she felt like that 15-year-old girl again, seen, unheard, unworthy. But deep in her chest, beneath the exhaustion and fear, something still stirred. Not pride, not ego, but the faces of the children she taught. The little ones who called her Miss Z and believed they could be more because she had dared to believe. First, opening day at Lane Academy was supposed to be triumphant, the culmination of years of scraped knees, sleepless nights, and whispered promises. But as Zariah stood at the edge of the makeshift stage in the main hall, her heart sank. Half the chairs were empty. The few parents and children who had shown up sat scattered, uncertain. A storm of legal threats hung in the air. The district's licensing board had issued a final warning that morning. If she dared to open without proper approvals, she would face court injunctions and potential closure. Her staff looked to her for direction. Zariah felt her throat tighten, fear climbing like vines inside her chest. Every word she'd prepared evaporated. Then the door creaked open. Mr. David Cole walked in slowly, a little grayer than before, but with the same fire in his eyes that had once told a lost 15-year-old girl to keep reading. He walked straight to the stage and nodded at Zariah, asking without asking if he could speak. She stepped aside. He turned to face the room and spoke with quiet conviction. I taught for 30 years, he began, and in that time, I watched kids give up, not because they were lazy, but because they were invisible. But not Zariah. I watched this girl study with no desk, no light, no help. She stayed late to ask questions no one had time to answer. She taught herself algebra with second-hand books. She read Shakespeare by candlelight. She didn't wait for opportunity, she became one. A hush fell over the room. Then the front doors opened again. More people began filing in. Some wore work uniforms. Some held toddlers on their hips. Others clutched notebooks and nervous hope. They came in waves. Former classmates, neighbors, parents, the kids she had once tutored in her garage. And then, from the back, Avery Thomas stepped in with a full camera crew. Microphones were clipped. Lights were raised. One of Zariah's earliest tutoring students, now a freshman in college, stepped forward, voice trembling but proud. "I never saw myself in school," she said. "I was told I wasn't smart enough, but Miss Z made me believe I belonged in a classroom. She didn't just teach us, she saw us." Applause erupted like thunder, loud and long and defiant. The licensing board representative, who had quietly slipped in hoping to document failure, now stood awkwardly near the exit. Phones were recording. Reporters whispered. The pressure was visibly in public. No one wanted to be on the side shutting down the girl who rose from poverty to power. By the time the applause died down, the seats were full, the aisles were crowded, and the spirit in the room had shifted. Zariah stepped up to the mic, hands still trembling, but her voice no longer uncertain. "I was expelled once for being poor," she said, "but today we open these doors for every child who's ever been told they don't belong. Lane Academy is not just a school, it's a second chance." No further threats came. The licensing board backed off, shamed into silence by the roar of the people. That afternoon, Zariah turned the key, opened the doors wide, and welcomed in the future one student at a time. Lane Academy became more than a school, it became a movement. There were no tuition fees, no rigid uniforms, no barriers dressed up as policy, just access, empathy, and a relentless pursuit of excellence. Zariah built a place where children who were once overlooked found their voice, where education wasn't a privilege, it was a right. She hired passionate local teachers, many of whom had grown up in the same neighborhoods as their students. She introduced night classes for working adults, offered hot meals to students who came to school hungry, and opened the library on weekends for anyone craving knowledge or simply a safe place to be. The halls echoed not with shame, but with laughter, curiosity, and belonging. Principal Mallory, bitter from the public exposure, filed a defamation suit, claiming Zariah had twisted history to villainize her. But Zariah's legal team countered with testimonies from former students, parents, and staff, covering years of discriminatory practices during Mallory's tenure at Cambridge Prep. The court dismissed Mallory's suit swiftly. Her name, once synonymous with authority, became a cautionary tale in education forums and social panels across the state. Respect was something she had demanded, but never earned. Zariah had earned it quietly. Through service and truth, Angela's health remained fragile, but her spirit soared. On a crisp morning, bundled in a shawl and supported by Zariah's arm, she finally visited the school. When she saw her daughter's name on the freshly painted sign, Lane Academy, founded by Zariah Lane, she paused, tears clouding her eyes. "I always knew you were bigger than this world let you be," she whispered. Zariah held her close, the two of them standing on ground once soaked in struggle, now blooming with promise. Zariah, still young but wise beyond her years, began mentoring girls who reminded her of her 15-year-old self, bright, bruised by life, but unbreakable. She told them their story wasn't over just because someone tried to write them out of it. She turned her pain into purpose, her scars into blueprints. Lane Academy didn't just educate, it healed. And at its heart stood a girl who had once been expelled for being poor, now building futures from the very place that tried to bury hers. The halls of Lane Academy were quiet under the soft hum of the evening lights, their once cracked walls, now painted in warm tones, lined with student artwork and hopeful quotes. Zariah walked slowly through them, the sound of her heels echoing faintly against the polished floor. She passed rooms filled with promise desks, waiting for eager hands, shelves stacked with books that once felt out of reach. When she reached room 3B, she paused. The door creaked open like an old memory, familiar and heavy. This was the classroom where she'd once sat in silence, wearing shoes that didn't match. Pretending not to hear the laughter behind her, she stepped inside. The room had changed, but the air still held fragments of who she used to be. On the whiteboard, she picked up a red marker and wrote in bold, careful strokes, "No child is ever too poor to learn. Love the girl you threw away." She stood back, staring at the words, her heart thudding with a mix of ache and pride. From her bag, she pulled out a small, worn frame, the same photo that had once sat beside her mother's bed. It was of her and Angela, cheek to cheek, both smiling wide despite the world around them. She placed it gently on the teacher's desk, the place where power once overlooked her but now belonged to her. Zariah stood in the doorway for a moment, longer, not as a student begging to belong, not even just as the founder of a thriving school, but as a woman who had taken every closed door, every insult, every scar, and turned them into a legacy. She hadn't just returned, she had rewritten the ending, and with it opened the beginning for every forgotten child who would now walk these halls, no longer invisible, but seen, heard, and worthy.